We're continuing our series on the unconventional life to which Jesus calls. And essentially the life that he calls his followers to is marked by actions and attitudes that are often in contrast to the actions and the attitudes of the world. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount offers some very unconventional wisdom, and he calls his followers to a higher standard. But he doesn't just call us to a higher standard, he also set the example for us so that we can follow his lead as to how we ought to live. In Matthew chapter 7, the first 6 verses are going to be our text for this morning. So I want to encourage you to be turning there. But just by way of reminder of what Jesus is doing with the Sermon on the Mount is he's trying to help his followers understand the kind of heart and the kind of motives that they ought to have, the kind of life that God calls his people to live. And so through this teaching, Jesus is addressing some of the misunderstandings or even some of the misteachings of those that are living during this time. And he addresses it very plainly, and he acknowledges that there are some events or experiences that may be challenging for us, but this is the life to which God has called his people. And so Jesus is trying to help us understand the kind of heart and the kind of life that we are to have. And here in chapter 7, we see him continuing his teaching. And he opens up in chapter 7 by helping us to see this need to understand judgment. Listen to what he says in verses 1 and 2. Judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And so the question often comes in discussions is, what does Jesus mean when he says, judge not? That's really kind of the overarching question that surrounds this particular portion of the text. When Jesus is teaching here, again, remember, he is addressing our heart, our actions, our motives, and he's calling us to think about those elements in life and the kind of life that he has called us to live. And so that's his basis for this particular teaching. And so he's calling his followers with this particular statement, he's calling them to avoid hypocritical or harsh judgments or statements. I think it's important for us to recognize and understand that there is a subtle difference between judgment and discernment. And although these two are closely related, I think given this context, the difference between these two has to do with the attitude of the one judging or discerning. Again, keep in mind what Jesus is doing with the teaching. And so he's focusing squarely on our attitude. And I think the principle of reciprocity of judgment that we often kind of experience but maybe don't think a lot about comes into play in this. So this principle, it refers to the idea that people tend to reciprocate the very judgments or evaluations that they receive. And so this principle operates in a very foundational way of looking at mutual exchange. So when we interact with one another, there seems to be a mutual exchange. And so a positive judgment or a positive evaluation is likely going to yield a positive response. The same is true in the negative sense. Essentially, it evolves from the social norm of responding to others in kind. And I'm convinced that Jesus understands this about humanity. And in this particular portion of his teaching, he's trying to get us to see clearly what he's referring to. With whatever measure we use, that's the measure that will be used toward us. Now, that has to do with a scale. And so you think in terms of, during this time, weighing different goods for purchasing. And as I'm sure you're well aware, there were some who were thieves or crooks, and they tried to make a weight heavier than maybe what it was, or lighter than what it was indicated, so that the benefit would be for them. And Jesus is saying, whatever measure you use, that's the measure that will be used toward you. And so in his teaching here, Jesus is elevating this teaching of reciprocity of judgment to the standard to which he calls his followers. And I'm convinced that from this, we learn that we ought to live in such a way that we reflect a Christ-like spirit to other people. We ought to remember that the way that we respond to others, the way that we treat others, will in fact be reciprocated to us. And so we ought also to recognize that the standards of judgment that we use reflect on us as followers of Jesus. And so if we are harsh, or if we are rude or mean-spirited in the way that we address people or issues around us, if we are harsh or mean or rude in the way that we comment on certain issues or certain posts on our socials, then that's going to have a negative impact upon us as followers of Jesus, but it's going to have a negative impact upon God and Christ to the people outside of the church. Our responses to others have a direct impact on how others respond to God and to Christ. And Jesus is saying, you need to pay attention to your judgment. And then Jesus offers this understanding of being self-aware. And so in verses 3 down through 5, Jesus says this: why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but you do not notice the log that's in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there's a log in your own eye? He says, you hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll be able to see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. These are familiar words to us, aren't they? And Jesus is illustrating something that no doubt comes from his time spent working in a carpenter's workshop. It exposes graphically the hypocrisy of the sort of attitude that he mentions in verses 1 and 2. And so what Jesus is getting at here is he is saying, listen, the speck, or the karphos is the word, this tiny splinter of wood or straw that you see in your brother's eye, how is it that you can say to your brother, let me get that speck out of your eye, when there's a log in your own eye? Jesus is being somewhat humorous in the way that he's teaching here. But this word for speck is a word that was often used metaphorically for those things that were minute. And the word for log is dokos, and it means a timber or a beam. And so think, for example, the times that you've been around some kind of carpentry work, or maybe building a house or whatever it might be, and you're there and you're seeing all of this go on. And one of the things that I hated most about helping Lindsay's dad, which he built several houses, and as the son-in-law, I was kind of here, help me with this. No, I love working with him, but one of the things that I hate most about building a house is having to sweep up the rooms and keep the area clean. There's a lot of sawdust on the floor, right? Now, contrast that, this is what Jesus is doing. Contrast a little piece of sawdust with one of the rafter beams, or with a big beam that spans across a living room to support the weight of the roof. How vastly different are they in size? And Jesus is saying we need to make sure that we are understanding ourselves, seeing ourselves clearly. Again, Jesus seems to be somewhat humorous in his teaching here, though this is certainly a serious teaching and a serious point that he's making with his followers, because this tends to be the way we react and respond, doesn't it? It's so easy for us to see the mistakes in others and even become annoyed and frustrated by them, but we fail to see our own shortcomings. We often miss the responsibility that we've been given to be self-aware, to be self-reflective, to check our own actions, our hearts, and our motives. Part of the issue, I think, is that we are quick to criticize. The American evangelist D.L. Moody, I'm sure some of you have read about him if you like much history. D.L. Moody was approached, he's well known for his evangelistic efforts. Well, he was approached by a man one time who said to him or suggested to him that his evangelistic methods were not the most effective methods to use. And Moody responded to him and just said, I really appreciate opportunities that I have to grow and to learn new methods or new ways of reaching out. So would you mind sharing with me what your techniques or your methods are? And the man responded to him, well, I don't really do much of that. To which Moody responded, well, I'll just stick to mine then. The reality is we are quick to criticize, aren't we? We fail to give attention to self-reflection. This is not the way that Jesus would have his followers to be. As a matter of fact, Jesus is instructing here with these verses, he's instructing his followers to examine their hearts, to examine their actions, to take a look at their motives and see where they are. And really that is at the heart of what Jesus is getting at in this section of teaching, though we often stop at the beginning and we say, look, Jesus says don't judge. You can't judge me. That's kind of where we go, right? But that's not exactly what Jesus is getting at. Again, Jesus is addressing through the Sermon on the Mount, not just in this particular portion, but throughout, the fact that we have to check our hearts. So let me say this. If you are not engaged in the ministries of this church family, if you are not actively serving, then do not criticize the efforts of those that are. Let me say that again. If you are not actively engaged and actively serving in the ministries of this church family, then do not criticize the efforts of those that are. That's what Jesus is trying to get across. He's trying to get us to make sure that we check our heart first. And when we do that, then we'll be able to see clearly to help our brothers and sisters. There's no place in the church for that kind of attitude. Jesus calls us to a higher standard, and it's up to us to obey his command. And he's wanting us to understand that self-awareness and self-reflection are the foundations of a Christ-like spirit. Again, he's calling us to something, calling us to a different way of living, not the way that we have always heard that we ought to live, not the way that the world says we ought to live, but the way that God is calling his people to live. Jesus is calling us to that higher standard, and self-awareness and self-reflection are the foundations of that Christ-like spirit that he longs for us to have. But there's an interesting aspect that comes out of this particular teaching of Jesus. I want you to think about it for just a moment. The assessment of the one with the log in his eye toward the one that has the speck in his eye is accurate. His assessment is accurate. So I would say this, that the one that does, in fact, have a speck in his eye, has a speck in his eye. And so Jesus in his teaching is indicating that the hypocrite's assessment or the hypocrite's diagnosis of his brother is correct. But the failure of this particular one with the log in his eye is that he is not using the same kind of judgment toward his brother that he so meticulously metes out on his brother. Jesus is calling us to be self-aware, to be self-reflective. And we have to do that first before we can address anything with our brothers and sisters. We cannot be like this hypocrite. We must make sure that we are self-aware. And then Jesus teaches us that we need to have proper discernment. Look at verse 6. Jesus says, "Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. The phrase, what is holy, most likely is a reference to the message of God to his people. And I think here in this case, it may very well reference the gospel. You know, dog is a term that came to be a derogatory term for a person who was apart from or outside of Israel's covenant community. For us today, when we hear the word dog, it conjures up cute images of well-groomed dogs, doesn't it? And we think about it. We can find pictures of dogs like this, and maybe that's all that comes across your Facebook feed. I don't know. Or maybe cats. But anyway, we're talking about dogs this morning. This is what we think of when we see this word or hear this word dogs, isn't it? I mean, these images just come into our mind. But I want to remind us that what we're seeing as far as Jesus is concerned here in his teaching comes from the ancient world. And in the ancient world, dogs lived in the streets. They were scavenging animals. They were often wild and unclean animals. As a matter of fact, in Psalm 59, David references his enemies as being that of dogs. And so think about what he says. It's Psalm 59, verses 14 and 15. As he's describing his enemies, each evening they come back, howling like dogs and prowling about the city. They wander about for food and growl if they do not have their fill. And so I wonder, why would David use this if dogs in the ancient world were cuddly and cute? Well, the reason is they weren't. They weren't seen that way. Now, the truth is there were some that were somewhat domesticated. They were trained to guard flocks and even at times to guard humans. But they were seldom ever brought into a home. They lived on the street. They were wandering around for food, and they would growl if they didn't have enough. To refer to a person as a dog was a grave insult, reducing that person's status to among the very lowest of the social scale. And although dogs were at times trained, as I said, they were for the most part scavenging animals, unclean animals. And so Jesus' statement here when he says, do not give to dogs that which is holy. When Jesus makes this, he's telling his disciples, do not treat the gospel message as discarded food to be thrown to scavengers who are outside the kingdom. Don't treat the message of God in that way. Make sure that you are wise about it. Now, he also mentions pigs, and they, like dogs, were usually wild, scavenging animals. As a matter of fact, that's where the Arkansas Razorbacks got their mascot. They weren't originally the hogs, but because of a game they played years ago, Lathan, they got the nickname. These were like wild hogs running on the field. Well, the truth is, pigs were seen in very much that way, and they were. And so pearls, in this context, symbolizes the very value of the message. And what Jesus is trying to do, again, is to help his followers understand that we do not need to treat the message of God as though it's discarded food to throw out to wild animals. I think for us, the import is that we need to make sure we are wise in our assessments. Some people would question this particular statement from Jesus, and they would say, that sounds an awful lot like judging. I thought he just said a few verses earlier in this teaching, I thought he said, judge not. And this sounds an awful lot like we've got to make some kind of judgment. Remember that I said earlier, there is a difference between judgment that Jesus discusses in verses 1 and 2 and the kind of discernment that we are to have here in this particular passage. The judgment that we've already talked about focuses primarily on the fact that we do not need to have some kind of hypocritical or harsh judgment toward other people. And here in verse 6, the discernment that Jesus is calling us to have is that which deals with wise assessments and wise actions and avoiding foolishly casting away the gospel. And so, from this teaching in these first 6 verses out of chapter 7, we learn a few things from Jesus. I think one, for us, we learn that we need to make sure that we approach others with humility and with love. We need to treat each other with kindness, understanding that we too have our own flaws. And we don't need to live hypocritically, but rather we need to live humbly as we interact with one another. And part of that has to do with being wise in addressing issues with our brothers and sisters, or with others even. Being wise about the way that we interact. Again, having that self-reflection to know that, yes, I make mistakes as well. And so I need to be wise in the way that I address issues. We regularly need to reflect on our own lives and on our own actions. And I think in order to do that, we need to be seeking accountability from people that we trust. Having that accountability from one another to hold us to what Christ has called us to, encouraging and supporting one another. And I think, too, we learn that we need to recognize receptive hearts. We need to invest in those hearts so that we can avoid wasting efforts on those that are hostile toward the message. There are some people that just don't want to hear about God or Christ. And I think Jesus is teaching us, for those people who are as dogs, those people who are as pigs, wild, not receptive, those that are just out for their own good or their own gain. Don't waste time. Don't cast the valuable message of salvation toward them, because they may very well turn and attack you. We're seeing that a lot today, aren't we? Again, Jesus is just simply teaching, be wise in the way that you act, the way that you interact. Ultimately, 3 things that I think we learn directly from Jesus. One is that we need to avoid hypocritical judgments. We need to make sure that our life that we're living is what it ought to be. And we need to make sure that we're not harsh or rude or mean-spirited toward others around us. And I think a second thing we learn is that we need to focus on self-examination. All of these kind of go together. And when we focus in on self-examination, I think it helps us to be able then to help our brothers and sisters, to make those wise judgments or discernments about situations that we find ourselves in. But it takes us digging deep into our heart and reflecting on all of the teaching of Jesus and saying, where is my heart in this? Where are my motives? What's my intent behind this? Am I selfish? I just want what I want? Or do I really have the best interest of my brother or sister in mind? And finally, I think we have to exercise proper discernment. When our heart is right, when we're living the kind of life that Jesus has called us to live, I think these things will come a little easier. They're not easy, but they'll come a little easier because we'll stop and we'll remember the example that Jesus set, and we'll consider his teaching, and we'll know that it has an impact on our life first and foremost. And ultimately, with that pure heart, we'll be able to support and encourage our brothers and sisters. We'll be able to help a brother who falls. We'll be able to encourage a brother or sister who is desperately in need of support. This morning, you may be struggling in the way that you interact with people around you. It may be that for far too long you've been judgmental and harsh and mean-spirited in the way that you react. Understand that that's not the life that Jesus has called you to live. That's not the attitude that he wants you to have. Make sure today that you take the opportunity to commit your life to following his example. Maybe you've never put Christ on in baptism, but you want to be a new creature today. You can do that by confessing your faith in Jesus and repenting of your sins and being baptized in the blood of Christ, having that blood wash your sins away. if we can help you or pray for you in any way, please come while we stand together and sing.